Hello and welcome to episode 5 of the Rewriting Crash Course. Today I'm going to be talking about midpoints specifically. Welcome again to the channel. This should be a fun episode, and I think this is going to be helpful to some of you who feel like you have problems in your second act. Your second act isn't working as clearly as you'd like. And again, like I say in each of the videos, if you are interested in working with me one-on-one, there is a link below this video, and we can have a conversation about working together one-on-one to fix your screenplay. And without further ado, let's get into the video here. So today I'm going to be talking about midpoints, why they're valuable, why they work, this sort of thing. So when we build out let's do it a little cleaner. Build out your story circle, right? So if this is your whole story, right? We have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8. All of you should be fully used to this by now. So if this is your entire screenplay, right? Entire screenplay beginning to end, your midpoint is going to happen kind of here, right? These are sort of your midpoint together, which makes sense that it would be at the 5 is, the exact middle of your story. And then if you kind of think about this, what you probably have is like, this is your first act. So this is kind of like act 1. This kind of becomes like probably kind of act 2. And then this over here is kind of act 3. So 7 is like the climax, essentially. So 7 being like the return, aka the resolution of the conflict. So, in traditional stories, this might be your character returning home from whatever battle or journey adventure that they've gone on. That's kind of traditional hero's journey. But it also just simply means that the resolution of conflict is taking place, and that usually happens because you have a climax and this sort of thing. However, we are focusing on 5 and 6 down here as the midpoint of your story. So the midpoint, essentially, when we think about the structure here, right? And I looked at this a little bit in the previous video. What we're doing is this is a structure that forces your character sort of through their character arc journey. And so we talked about how they get what they want, right? And they pay for it. So remember that we have character, want, get, and pay here. And these are sort of the big points that we talked about. So what happens is once they pay, then they must make a new decision and keep moving forward. And so in your story, the biggest decision that they must make, the biggest cost, creates the biggest action forward, the biggest new want, and essentially forces your character to decide who they are and how they view the world and all of this sort of stuff. And so the point of this is essentially in the first half of your story, your character has some sort of idea what they're doing, right? So if we take we erase all this and we just sort of think about, your story, how I did last time, which is kind of like 4 story circles in your story. What you have happen is your character Okay, so this is act 1. This is your story circle for act 2, part 1. This is your story circle for act 2, part 2. This is act 3. So really what happens is when your character goes from act 1 into act 2, part 1, they have a general sense of what's going on and what they're trying to do, right? They understand, okay, well, we're trying to do this. We're trying to take down this guy, whatever. So a couple examples I've used a lot, for Parasite, let's say, in Parasite, the family is trying to take all of the jobs that other people are working for this rich family so that they can get this consistent source of income and essentially, become parasites on this richer family. That's kind of the goal. Then another example of this is The Martian. Mark Watney is stranded in the very beginning of the film. And so then the plan is to essentially connect with NASA and get a plan formulated for how to get him home. And then in The Dark Knight, Joker enters the story, and Batman is just essentially trying to take down the Joker in Act 2, Part 1. So in each time, the characters have an understanding of what they're trying to do. Then what happens is you have your midpoint, and this is the sort of huge cost that happens. They kind of get what they want, and it comes at some sort of huge cost that sends them over this kind of line into the unknown world, right? So essentially, it's like now they have to solve problems they did not account for in the beginning. And this is what sends your story into the second half and forces your character into their biggest point of change. This is why in a lot of times you see characters, they have kind of their arc decision at either the end of Act 2, Part 2, or the beginning of Act 3, because they had to deal with some sort of huge problem at the midpoint that then forces them to actually fully change as a character so that they can take on whatever new problem they are facing. And so not only does a midpoint work to anchor sort of the structure of your story, it also anchors your character's arc as well. So, let's kind of break this down a little bit. So in Parasite, right, what is the huge problem, or what is essentially the midpoint, right? The 5 and 6 in Parasite is the characters, the family gets what they want. They get all of the jobs, working for this rich family. And then the pay is that the old housekeeper comes back and they realize that there's this other guy living in the basement, and there's all these new problems that they did not account for, and they have this huge fight with the old housekeeper, and they are shoved into a new world that they did not account for. Same thing for The Dark Knight. Batman is trying to just take down the Joker, and then when the Joker is captured, it seems like everything is going to be fine. But then the Joker has already planned for this. Rachel dies, and this sends Batman into the unknown world, right? The person closest to him in his life has now been killed, and he does not know what to do. Same for The Martian. They formulate a plan for 5. They get what they want. NASA and Mark Watney formulate a plan on how to get him back, and then the hab explodes, sending Mark into the unknown world and not knowing what to do next. And so this is why the midpoint can become so extremely valuable for your story, because it forces your characters to make decisions on a level that they haven't been forced to make yet. And this also can be great for you as the writer getting that interest from your audience, because what you're doing is, when everything goes wrong in this way for your character, the audience has no idea how they're going to get out of this new situation. And that is great for you, because it means that they're actually interested in what happens next. And of course, that's exactly what we want as screenwriters. So you're sending your character into that unknown world, and this forces your character to actually grow, right? And remember that ultimately what the purpose of story is for that character arc to then show a particular philosophical conflict or idea about living, or essentially just the choices that people must make in hard times. And therefore, it all sort of fits nicely together. So the question also becomes, which I've had this kind of question, right? So we have this, let me erase some of this to make things, give myself a little bit of room here. So we have, these sort of 4 circles, right? And each one of these are supposed to have their own kind of circle. And then, like I said earlier, the story as a whole is supposed to have its own circle, right? So the question becomes, where does the midpoint go in this kind of version of the outline, right? So if this over here, right, if we have kind of the whole story, so this is the big story, and this has its own story circle, where does the midpoint go, right? So obviously, this is kind of where our midpoint is. It's the get and the cause. They're kind of they are connected, right? The midpoint is kind of both of them. You could say that the midpoint is the cost or the midpoint is the get, but it's both of them. So where it usually happens is kind of Act 2, Part 1 here. So what will likely happen, and this is kind of what I've seen a lot of the time. So for example, in The Dark Knight, this is kind of how it works. So he enters, Joker kind of enters the story kind of at the end of Act 1 into Act 2, and then the whole focus is getting the Joker. They get the Joker, but but it cost him Rachel, and then we are sent into the second half of Act 2, which is the Joker's kind of on the loose and Batman is looking for him, and then we go into Act 3 like that. So sometimes it can kind of be here, and it can kind of be set up like this. Now, also again, these, the more that you understand what you're doing, the easier it will actually be for you to make calls and kind of, make these switches. So because the conflict doesn't end, you don't really have the 7. And so this kind of does become the end of your Act 2, Part 1. And so you really have kind of 4 acts in your story. Because then this is essentially them trying to handle the fallout of what happened in Act 2, Part 1. And then after they're starting to handle the fallout, what happens in a lot of stories doesn't have to work like this every time. But what happens in a lot of stories, they make kind of their key change in Act 2, Part 2, and then we go into Act 3 to handle, whatever the big final external conflict is, and then we end. So this is kind of how it happens with The Dark Knight is, Batman kind of chooses what he's going to do, and then we are sent into our Act 3. Same with The Martian. Mark Watney chooses to keep surviving. He chooses not to allow this intensely terrible situation to get the better of him. He resolves to keep fighting, and then we have our Act 3. So when you're thinking about your big story, you want to kind of beat it out this way, keeping in mind that this is going to be the midpoint. And then when you are coming down into your kind of, act by act story circles, then usually your midpoint is going to sit right here, kind of in Act 2, Part 1. And remember that this is not kind of a scene by scene outline. What you're doing here is you're understanding the sweeping turns of the story. So then, there may be 7 scenes that are your midpoint here, or 4 scenes here, that it's not like scene, and every story has, 36 scenes or something. But hopefully that kind of makes sense. So this is not, as big as understanding the basic story structure and this sort of thing, but midpoints are huge and they can be super valuable for you when you are actually trying to figure out how the heck do I make my second act work, and where does the momentum come from? The momentum comes from understanding your midpoint, understanding how your story is supposed to flow in the sense of, want, get, and cost. And this will give you that kind of driving momentum to keep your second act focused. I hope that's helpful to you. And if you're interested in working with me one-on-one, again, there is a link below. We can book a call and talk about working together one-on-one. Hopefully this video was helpful to you. If it was, please leave a like, and I will see you in the next video.